So I just wanted to welcome everybody to the first of our Achieved Chats. I'm Melise Blakesley. I'm the Managing Partner of SQL Technology and IP Law, as well as the President of Achieved Compliance. If you don't know what we do here at Achieved Compliance, we provide an automated, collaborative, cross-departmental process for GDPR due diligence that allows you to do your data mapping as well as implement sort of a good accountability framework. And we couple this with consulting on the achieved compliance side of things. We've been very involved for the past 20 years in data privacy issues, particularly here in the US and in the EU. And it occurred to us that what would be really helpful for our clients and for others is to just have a series of informal chats, bringing to people's attentions things that are happening at the global level that are likely to be impacting us here in the U.S., particularly with respect to small and medium-sized businesses. So the purpose of these chats are that just to take 30 minutes, perhaps every couple weeks, to keep our clients and others informed of things that we see going on as we begin to implement the GDPR framework here in the U.S. Just a couple of notes here at the outset. All the participants are actually muted, and we are recording the session. If you have a question, if you could either in the question section just type it, and perhaps we will be able to answer those questions at the end, or if you'd like, you could at the end, we'll save a little bit of time for questions, you could just raise your hand virtually and ask the question. You don't have to identify yourself, and we'll see if we could answer it. With that, I wanted to allow Paula Breening to introduce herself. I'll actually say that she's our Senior Director of Global Privacy Policy here at Achieved Compliance. Paula, did you want to just talk a little bit about your background?
Sure. Thank you, Melise, and it's good to be with everyone this morning. I have been involved in data protection and privacy issues for about 25 years, working both here in the United States and in the EU. I've done this in government as well as in the private sector, and most recently I was involved in the negotiations on the European Union's GDPR in Brussels while I was Senior Director for Global Privacy Policy for Intel Corporation. So I've been looking at GDPR, the requirements, the policy ramifications for quite some time now, and it's really good to be here to be able to share all this with you.
Thank you, Paula. So we've only got 30 minutes today, so let me just give everybody sort of an overview of where we're going. We thought that discussing what went on at the recent IAPP meeting, which is the International Association of Privacy Professionals, we thought that giving everybody a little bit of an overview of what happened at that meeting, not necessarily the content of the seminars, but mainly high-level observations as we're leading up to GDPR implementation on May 25th, that it'd be useful to give folks sort of a flavor of what was really going on there. And then because the Cambridge Analytica case was breaking at the same time as the meeting, we've been very involved in, sort of talking about this issue, and we have our ears to the ground in terms of how this might play out here in the U.S. So we wanted to touch on that as well, to give folks some takeaway about how what's happening with respect to Facebook and Cambridge Analytica is likely to start impacting us, particularly for small and medium-sized businesses eventually here in the U.S. So actually what I'd like is Paula to just give you an overview. She's been attending IAPP for years, and I think her observations of how it's changed and what was the topics of conversation were very interesting. So I wanted to make sure Paula was able to share this with our clients. Paula?
Sure. I think for those who may not be familiar with IAPP, it is the International Association of Privacy Professionals, and it's the professional organization for individuals involved in privacy, data protection, data security, and other related data issues. It serves an education function. a convening function. It is a tremendous networking opportunity where you can meet other professionals, learn from them, share your experience in dealing with data issues within your company or your organization. The summit meeting that took place now about a month ago is an annual event that's held in Washington. It's IAPP's biggest event, and it really attracts policymakers from around the globe, regulators, academics, and other experts, non-governmental organizations, and most importantly, companies that are, and their representatives who are dealing with these issues as they run their businesses. I think it's worth noting that in 2012, there were 10,000 members of IAPP. And since then, that number has grown to 36,000 in 100 countries. And these are companies that are working across industries of all sizes who are really grappling with these issues. And at this meeting in particular, there were 3,500 participants, which is a very high subscription rate for a meeting like this. And I think it's an indication of the growth and importance of this issue and the recognition across companies that this is something that they're really going to have to deal with, data issues, whether they're in the United States or in Europe or anywhere else across the globe.
So, Paul, obviously GDPR was a big topic on the panels. A lot of the formal time was spent discussing GDPR. What I thought, when you returned from the meeting, what I thought was most interesting was sort of your observations about really what was being discussed outside of the meetings with respect to GDPR, and sort of your takeaway in terms of what some of that might mean for U.S. business. So do you mind sharing that with the people on the line?
Sure. I think Melise is exactly right. GDPR was top of mind at the meeting. Everybody, was talking about the work that's going into complying with it. A lot of discussion of the resources and the time that's being invested, as well as developing the internal expertise within companies to be able to do this work over the long term. There was a compliance boot camp. There were discussions of access rights, record keeping, the whole range of requirements that you see in the GDPR. But what was also very clear is that this is not going away, that there is no change in deadline. And I think one of the things that I heard, and I've heard this before, is this sense that GDPR compliance, whether you manage to do it by May 25th or at whatever point thereafter, it's really not the end of the conversation. It's the beginning. This is going to be an ongoing effort that companies are going to have to undertake. And I think that high subscription rate for this meeting that we saw is an indication that there's a recognition that this is just the beginning of an ongoing project of good governance within companies.
So the other thing I thought was, and maybe this was because it was intersecting with the Cambridge Analytica case, and is one of the things I thought was very interesting was you had come away from the meeting with the feeling about, discussions about regulation potentially here in the U.S. So why don't we jump right into, maybe you can talk a little bit about the Cambridge Analytica case and the things that you were hearing at IAPP and also through our contacts with regulators in the EU. Sort of the general observation of how that's going to eventually start impacting us here in the U.S.
Right. The Cambridge Analytica case had just broken just very recently before the meeting, and so there was a lot of conversation about it in the hallways and at the meetings. And I think that one of the things that kept coming up, and I actually heard this from European regulators, is that this is not just a social media issue, that, we're talking about questions around big data analytics, data brokers, the Internet of Things, and that we're talking about the harvesting of data that was, that was disclosed for social media purposes to be used for other purposes that the individual may not have known about. And so this, while the Facebook case is interesting and has been fascinating to watch, it's really indicative of a bigger question that's being grappled with. And one of the things that I heard that I hadn't heard for a while are new calls for legislation in the United States for some kind of omnibus privacy legislation that would that would govern these issues. It would be that sort of legislation, or some legislation that would be focused on social media and data brokers, sort of as a stand apart from the rest of the data environment. We've seen this before in the United States, particularly that call for omnibus legislation, and there have been several attempts to introduce bills, and none of them have been successful. There was one as recently as during the Obama administration, and it really didn't get any traction. But I think that what's different this time is that there's a public awareness about this issue. There were the hearings that were broadcast last week, and they got a lot of attention. Everybody's on Facebook. People, you may not be aware of, the Internet of Things deployment, or you may not be aware of how big data analytics works, but the world is on Facebook, and everybody's aware of that platform. And so it could change the dynamic around this call for legislation in the United States. I would add to that the Article 29 Working Party of the European Commission, which is the advisory body made up of representatives of each of the member state data protection authorities, also weighed in right after the hearing and said that, again, that this is one instance of what they see as a widespread practice of harvesting personal information for other purposes, and that they are going to be instituting a working group on social media. They want to develop a long-term strategy about how to deal with the issue. So I think we're going to be seeing pressure, at the very least, from Europe, but I think there's also going to be a lot more discussion about this in the United States that could finally end up with legislation, although I think there's also a lot of competing political demands right now that may push us in the background, but I think it's going to be something that we're going to be hearing more about going forward because it is now a more public discussion.
Mm-hmm. And actually, could you just comment a little bit on how the Facebook situation also is impacted with respect to the FTC consent judgments that were already in place? Because I think a lot of folks don't, it's not top of mind, the fact that the FTC here in the U.S. does police what we mean in our privacy policies when we talk about reasonable and appropriate measures with respect to processing data and security of data. And so we tend to be focusing a lot on GDPR, but even the Facebook situation, I've heard that from at least in the newspapers that some of the regulators are concerned about the potential violation of consent judgments here in the U.S. with respect to Facebook.
Yes, well, Facebook has been under a consent decree with the Federal Trade Commission since 2011. And in that consent decree, they've been required to implement an accountability program, which is really a sort of a governance structure around data within their within the company that moves beyond sort of the traditional notions of notice and choice that we've all been operating, particularly in the United States, for quite some time. And it has required that they, institute policies that that result in good privacy outcomes, that they monitor those policies and the programs that they've built around them to make sure that they're ending up with good privacy. They need to be, there needs to be responsibility for data, whether they're processing the data or they're outsourcing or sharing that data for processing. And so now there is a lot of question being raised about whether or not Facebook has violated that consent decree with the FTC. But I think the bigger message that is coming from that is that this is what the Federal Trade Commission is going to be looking for from all companies going forward. If you are, watching those FTC consent decrees over time, increasingly that's the requirement that they're putting in place for companies that have come under investigation. The requirement that they build that governance structure in their company, and so I think that's something that all companies should be watching closely. There is the larger question of social media and data analytics, but this is something that is influencing companies, of all sizes across a range of industries, and it's something to definitely keep an eye on.
Mm-hmm. And we've actually, my observation is we've seen this before. Back in the early days when we first started to have privacy policies that were being posted on companies' websites. The FTC took positions about what that language meant in terms of the promises that were being made to consumers, and that there were certain governmental expectations about you can't just be making promises and not be doing anything in the back end to ensure that they are in fact true and that you're resulting in good outcomes. So we sort of lived through that generation of slowly but surely the FTC's view of things through its consent judgments have become the standard, industry standards. And so even in a lot of ways, the Europeans are lucky because they just have a statute that they can point to, whereas we here have to extrapolate out from FTC decisions and state decisions and attorney general's investigations to determine what is industry standard and what is the meaning in terms of accounting and transparency for data here in the U.S. But I would agree, it is becoming increasingly very similar to the GDPR accountability framework that we're doing so much work with. I'll also make the observation with the Facebook situation that for those who are in companies and where they're trying to encourage management to adhere to fair information practices and transparency, that going through the exercise of actually looking at your Facebook settings, your privacy settings, is really educational. How difficult it is to actually figure out what Facebook is doing with your data. And one of the things that I think, at least here in the US, we have a hard time getting our heads around is the fact that it's not merely the intake of data and how you store it and how you wrap security around it, but it's processing in a really broad sense. So taking data and combining it with other data, which is of course what Facebook does on an absolutely massive scale, is an activity that per se needs to be governed by the transparency and accountability principles of GDPR as well as the FTC's consent decrees. And for small and medium-sized businesses, that is a sort of a real aha moment, which is, wow, this is not merely how do I protect a name, address, and an email. This is about how do I combine that data with other aspects of data, whether that's from third parties, whether I've got for example, a customer service system that pulls in Facebook, LinkedIn, other demographic information about customers at the point of, for example, a telephone call. That's a type of processing of data that needs to be actually transparent to consumers. So everybody tends to think, well, I'm not Facebook, but in point of fact, my observation is small to medium-sized business is a lot more like Facebook than they think they are in terms of how we're combining data for all sorts of purposes. So I don't know whether you just wanted to comment on that, Paula.
Well, I think that the thing that I would add to that is, when you mentioned how difficult it was to, understand your privacy settings and change them. And I think that one of the things that we're going to be seeing from regulators, and I've heard this commented on several times already, is that they're looking for compliance not just with the letter of the regulation, but also with the spirit of it. And that, saying that you are providing a certain kind of transparency or a certain kind of control or asking for consent, but making it extremely difficult or confusing to do that is something that is going to be looked at closely. Because if the end you're not actually providing good privacy protections, you're really going to be sort of running afoul of the regulation. And that really was behind a lot of why the GDPR was developed and why those accountability principles were embedded in it, because it is so easy to build a notice and choice schema that makes it actually so confusing that the individual really doesn't know what they've consented to or that they've actually allowed the use of their data for certain purposes, and they may not even understand that. And the accountability principle was put in place to make sure that, in fact, you are, implementing policies that actually, in fact, provide protections for the consumer.
Yep, I just feel like we're just harping on that so much these days, is that accountability means being able to account for data. It's not about a revised privacy policy. So we're certainly seeing that daily. Actually, one of the things before, we only got about 10 more minutes here. One of the things I wanted to get your observations about is, what are the new conversations that are happening? I mean, we've all been around now, the GDPR issues for quite some time, but what are the new things you're hearing at IAPP and also from regulators in terms of, let's talk about midterm, what's the next thing we need to be thinking about in the data privacy area?
Well, there are several things that are on the horizon, and maybe the horizon's actually too far out already. There's a lot of discussion these days about some of the new data uses and implementations. Artificial intelligence is one of them. Again, big data analytics, the ubiquitous collection of data using sensor technology, and the way those are used in things like autonomous vehicles, and the Internet of Things. These are issues that can really strain some of our traditional thinking about data protection. And I think what was particularly interesting is that earlier this year, the European Data Protection Supervisor's Office released a study, or a report that was the result of a 3-year study on what they're calling data ethics. And what they're really trying to do in that report is look at some of these really difficult questions. Now, their starting point is different. In Europe, privacy is a fundamental human right, as is human dignity. And so they were looking at the issue of data ethics from that perspective and saying, and their message was, we need to get out ahead of some of this this technology and data deployment to make sure that we are doing this in a way that respects those fundamental rights. And they talked about the fact that those rights are things that allow people to, develop their personality, innovate, exercise their rights, associate with people that they want to associate with, lead independent lives. And so they said, let's look forward to these technologies, not saying that we shouldn't deploy them. This isn't an either or zero-sum game, but to say, how do we do this in a way that respects those values? And they see this as not just a current question, but this question of ethics is something that we're going to have to take into the future as, we move on yet again from artificial intelligence, machine learning, data analytics to new deployments of data and technology we haven't even thought about yet. I would say, though, that this is not just a question that's being raised in Europe. A lot of the non-governmental organizations, the privacy advocacy community, the academic community is looking really closely at these very same issues. And even the Federal Trade Commission has had workshops in the past to look at specific issues around things like artificial intelligence and data analytics. The Obama White House commissioned a report on data analytics and really tried to raise some of these questions about autonomy and individual choice. And things like discrimination, how, we like to think that these technologies and data uses can potentially help us avoid those issues, but in fact, we can build that same discrimination that we find in the, brick and mortar world. We can build that into data, sometimes unknowingly or unintentionally. And so I would say that these are things we're going to be looking at in the next 5 years very closely. And it sounds as though potentially, these are issues for bigger companies or, the high tech industry, when in fact, increasingly, smaller companies, medium-sized enterprises are going to be using these technologies, probably through vendors in many cases, but they are going to raise data issues for these smaller companies. So this is an area to watch.
Mm-hmm. As I mentioned previously, I've already been seeing this kind of thing in the customer service area, where for chats or telephone calls into retailers, they pull in at that point of the conversation a lot of information about the consumer, and recommendations and how the types of approach you take with a particular customer may depend a lot on the data that's crunched and then presented to the person that's on the telephone. So and that's implemented even, in small businesses, small to medium-sized businesses that are using various types of customer service software. So you're already seeing it start to creep in ways that very quickly, in point of fact. So actually, we are coming up against the end of our 30 minutes here. I just want to mention that if anybody has a question, you can raise your virtual hand or type one in, and we will attempt to answer it. So just give everybody a few moments to do that if they've got any questions. Was there anything that we haven't brought up here, Paul, that you wanted to mention while we're waiting for any questions?
No, I think we've covered all of it that we planned on. I think that the thing to bear in mind, from a policy standpoint on some of those new technology deployments is, they're really, and I can't emphasize this enough, they're really raising some hard questions. If you're engaging with AI, it makes it much harder to apply the fair information practice principles, but there are ways to think about them when you're crafting your privacy policy. The same goes for big data analytics. We're stepping into new territory, but there's a lot of work being done on this, and it is something that companies are going to need to stay aware of.
Mm-hmm. Yep. The other thing I would just add before we break here, because I think it's a really important message for everybody to hear, is about enforcement on GDPR. And I'm hearing this with every single client, how are they going to find me? What's the risk if I don't comply? It's part of the equation that management goes through. And I really have 2 points here. One is about insurance, which is there are now about 90 different carriers that are offering some sort of insurance coverage for GDPR fines. And I'm speaking next week at a insurance conference for companies that actually provide insurance to the technology area. And their general observation is at the moment coverage is pretty cheap because there hasn't been any fines and nobody really knows what they're underwriting. And so I suppose one thing to think about is if you feel that there's a risk for your company, is that now would be the time to get some insurance. The other thing that I wanted to bring up, and I'm actually just lost my point here. It'll come back to me. We actually have a question. Let's see. It says there's a gap between U.S. publishers and EU publishers in terms of GDPR awareness. Is there a plan to overcome this, like planning more events about GDPR? Paula, did you want to address that? I mean, we've participated in Department of Commerce road shows, but Paula, did you want to see if you could address this question?
Yeah, I think that's an important point, is the Department of Commerce work on this. The EU mission, the Department of Commerce mission in the EU in Brussels has organized now 2 series of informative sort of seminars for small and medium-sized companies in particular, to get them up to speed on what the requirements are, why they need to comply, why this benefits their business to do that. And so there's been now 2 rounds of that, and I know they are planning additional meetings. I would also say that, in Europe, there is a lot of work being done to inform consumers and to also inform small and medium-sized companies of their obligations. And I think that as U.S. companies do more business with European companies or do business that involves European clients, they're going to be sort of, through their engagement with other companies, they're going to become more and more aware of the requirements, because, as Melise suggested just a few minutes ago, there are going to be more contractual requirements. There's going to be more due diligence being done. So I think I think this is going to happen both through formal information talks, but also I think the market's going to push this a bit as well.
Yep. Did you happen to hear from Isabel? Are they planning more road shows, the Department of Commerce?
I didn't hear anything specific yet. I do know that the Department of Commerce office, the trade office in New York, talked about wanting to do more of this work, but I don't know of their specific plans yet.
Yep.
But I think that's something to keep our clients apprised of if they're interested.
Yep. So so essentially, just to recap on that point, the Department of Commerce ran these road shows. They had 2 big rollouts this past year. I think we have gone to maybe 50 cities. It's free. It was like an all-day or maybe half-day workshop. So if folks are interested in what the U.S. government is doing, I highly recommend going to the Department of Commerce website. And it's the Trade Mission, isn't it, Paula, that did them?
It's a trade mission that actually, the Trade Mission in Brussels is partnering with the Commercial Service in the United States.
Right. So that would be the place to look there. I know what my point was, which was about folks wanting to know, well, how are they going to be found? And one of the things that may not be apparent, and we've certainly heard this from regulators time and time again, is, and this goes to sort of Paula's point about Europeans becoming educated about their rights. If a data subject, an individual in the EU, is unhappy with how a business is handling their data, they have the right to go and lodge a complaint. So the different regulatory authorities in the 29 different countries have an obligation to investigate those complaints. And so a lot of times we think of this as just a breach issue, that this is going to come to somebody's attention if there's a breach, and hence if I just don't have a breach, I'm not going to have a problem. But where I observe, I think there's 3 places where we're more, as U.S. businesses, we're going to have problems, which is 1, labor issues. If a U.S. company has any labor in the U.S. or distributors or somebody who can be complaining about labor practices, this can be a whistleblower situation. Unhappy consumers, where you're not handling their data appropriately. EU consumers have a right to lodge a complaint against you. And then, of course, suppliers, vendors, third parties in the supply chain, up and down the supply chain, are going to be requiring contractual undertakings which require some due diligence to support them. So my general observation is that there's a lot more risk than folks think there is, because it's simply not a matter of breach. And in Europe, the GDPR and individuals' rights, they're plastering it on the side of buses. I mean, it's like everywhere, informing people of their rights. And there was a recent poll in Europe that said 1/3 of Europeans are anticipating, as soon as GDPR comes into full force, they anticipate actually using their individual rights to question various companies about how their data is in fact being used. So I think we're going to see a real tsunami of questions just from ordinary folks that are likely to become to reverberate here in the U.S. Let's see, is there any other questions? I'm just looking here. No, it does not appear there are any other questions. So I think we've used up our time here. Hopefully people found that to be some of the points there to be useful for them, and we will be trying to run these every couple weeks, just 30 minutes, high-level takeaways on some subject that we find of interest, and hope that our clients and others find interesting too. If you have anything or a topic that you'd like us to address in our 30-minute Achieve chats, let us know by email. We would certainly appreciate any ideas. We certainly feel that our mission is to help small to medium-sized American businesses implement good data practices here in the U.S. so that we can remain competitive in the global marketplace. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and see you next time. Bye-bye.